Okie doke. So I'm here to introduce Dr. Steve Kannenberg, who is our final candidate for the ecosystem ecologist position in our department. He received his bachelor's degree from St. Olaf College in Minnesota, and then got his PhD at Indiana University at Bloomington. And as part of that, he also got a minor in higher education. And he is currently a postdoc at the U of U, just down the road, with Jim Ellringer and William Andrade. And so he's been there since 2018. And as in his time there, he has progressed into more of a self-funded postdoc, most recently on a grant to the Department of Energy. His publication record is so far 17 papers and growing. And this includes publications in a diversity of outlets, including forest ecology and management, tree physiology, ecology letters, and global change biology. And I also might note that of these 17 publications, he's a first author on almost all of them. So I will turn it over to him now.
Great, thanks a lot for that introduction. This seems like it's working. Microphone, perfect. Cool, well, thanks to you all for being here. A lot of familiar faces in the audience. It's been nice to get to know some of you today, and looking forward to meeting more of you tomorrow. So before I begin, I want to start off with something that's obvious for any of these research seminars, and that's that there were a lot of people who went into the research that's going into this talk. Too many to name, too many students, too many colleagues. But I do want to give a special shout out to the mentors who've been really important in shaping me as a scientist and a person throughout the years, both at Indiana University and the University of Utah, and of course to all of the funding agencies that have been generously financially supporting this work throughout the years. So I want to start off with a little bit of a story. This is the main character of the story. This is my favorite office plant. When I started as a postdoc 3 years ago, I was gifted a really nice crop of office succulents, and they really thrived quite well in my office until the whole COVID thing started. And I'm sure you can remember in the pandemonium of those first few days of COVID, unfortunately, forgive me, I forgot to take my office plants out of my office and bring them home. And so what happened was this poor plant went around 4 to 5 months without water. And sure enough, when I went back to my office, the plants had died. Well, actually all of the plants had died except this one. This one was just hanging on by a thread. So I rewatered it, gave it a nice big pot, that one right there, some new soil, and sure enough, it recovered. So why am I starting off with this kind of corny story about my favorite office plant? Well, I think it's because what happened here is really emblematic of a lot of the questions that I think about on a daily basis as a forest ecosystem ecologist who thinks about drought a lot, right? I had all of these office plants sitting in my office. They were roughly the same size, roughly the same type of pot. They went the same exact time without water, but why is it this one that lived and all of the others died? These uncertainties regarding forest drought responses, like we observed with this office plant story, are really big uncertainties in forest drought ecology. And it's a really big aspect of my research program to tackle these. So for example, what happens to forests during a drought event? What happens to the cycling of carbon and water in and out of ecosystems? Which species are most impacted by the detriments of water stress? And finally, what happens after drought stress? Are trees able to recover after some sort of lag time here, or do they eventually kind of tumble through this trajectory that ultimately leads in their death? Now, these responses are a really massive uncertainty in our understanding of forest ecology. We really have a poor handle on how drought impacts forest ecosystems. But these types of questions aren't just relevant for understanding, the forests that you can see up in Logan Canyon or any of the local forests that you really care about. They're really massive uncertainties in the global carbon cycle as a whole. This is a graph that you've probably seen before. It details the large-scale carbon sources and carbon sinks globally. And what I want to draw your attention to is just how dynamic this line is between the land sink and the atmosphere. And one of the reasons that that line is so jagged is because of global water stress impacts on the amount of carbon that ecosystems can take up, in particular forest ecosystems. And so better understanding or constraining drought responses can really help us understand, these really important questions in global ecology, like the growth rate of atmospheric CO2. Now, unfortunately, understanding these uncertainties is only going to get more important in the future. Pretty much whatever climate trajectory we put ourselves on, we're going to see increases in the frequency and severity of drought, and that's going to be especially acute out here in the Western United States. But understanding a lot of these ecosystem scale responses to drought is extremely difficult. Forest ecosystems are incredibly complex. Their responses to drought are coordinated across a really wide range of processes that operate at a number of different spatial and temporal scales. And if that complexity wasn't enough, we have a lot of different methodologies to measure all of these different processes. And so it's a really important research frontier to be able to integrate across all of these different scales and processes to properly understand drought. Because the benefit of this, integrating across all of this, is that it allows us to take observations of individual processes, kind of shape them and mold them into generalizable patterns, which then we can use to really make predictions about the impacts of drought on large spatial and temporal scales. Now, the overall goal of my research program is to use this multi-scale, multi-methodology approach to understand how forests are going to fare in a warmer and drier world with more frequent and severe droughts. But that's a really broad question. That's probably a lifetime's worth of work there. And so for this talk today, I want to kind of take a more bite-sized piece, focusing on those two trajectories I showed you that forests can take after drought: the trajectory where they recover, kind of shown by this living tree here on the left, and the trajectory where they ultimately die, shown by the tree on the right. And that dichotomy is going to form the structure of this talk. The first part of the talk is going to be about the more optimistic scenario where trees can recover from drought stress. It's going to be about all of my work to understand when, where, and why lags in drought recovery occur, and what the importance is of these lags in drought recovery for the broader scale carbon cycle. The second section of the talk is going to be about the more morbid trajectory that trees take after drought, where they eventually die. It's going to be centered around a lot of ongoing research towards understanding a really mysterious drought-induced tree mortality event in southern Utah and across the southwestern United States as a whole, where for some mysterious reason, one of the most drought-tolerant tree species we have out here is dying. The third part of the talk is going to be a pivot towards some of my near, medium, long-term research aims on how we can use our understanding of forest ecosystem physiology and ecology to better predict the future of forests in a warming and drying world. So to start off, I want to return to the example of this office plant that I talked about in the beginning of this talk. If you recall, when I re-watered this plant, it eventually recovered. But the key concept here is that this recovery, it wasn't instantaneous. It took a number of days for these withered, shriveled leaves to regain their turgor. And it took weeks, even months, for all of the leaves that this plant had shed during the Steve-induced drought event for it to regrow all of those leaves. And it was, like half a year before it actually ended up looking this vibrant. Now, these lags in drought recovery have not just been found in office succulents. They've been documented in forests worldwide. They've been given this really fantastic term of a drought legacy effect, which I think does a great job of conceptualizing what's going on here. This drought is imprinting its legacy on the plant, on the ecosystem for weeks, days, months, even years in some cases. But unfortunately, beyond the fact that they exist in forests, we really don't know a lot about how large they are, how widespread they are, how long do they last. There are a lot of uncertainties with regards to these drought legacy effects and how they operate across the landscape. So to get at this question, to understand how large and prevalent these post-drought reductions in tree growth are, we turn to tree ring chronologies, which provide a really strong tool for understanding the drought responses of trees, or at least their radial growth, because with just a few samplings, we can reach back throughout the lifespan of the individual tree, pick out individual droughts, and quantify this tree's ability to recover its growth rate following drought. And that's exactly what we did. We ended up getting a couple hundred tree ring chronologies from around the conterminous United States, went back through these tree ring chronologies, identified severe, roughly a 1 in 50 year drought event. That's this -2 SPEI threshold. And we simply use these time series of radial growth to calculate the percent reduction in this tree's growth 1 year following drought after controlling for climatic conditions in the year following drought. So you can just think of it as simply an effect size. What did the drought do to tree growth in the year following drought? And this is what we found here. The blue colors are post-drought increases in growth, and the red colors are post-drought decreases in growth. And you'll probably notice a couple of really obvious things. Number one, there's a lot of red. The vast majority of the sites where we developed these tree chronologies, we found significant reductions in tree growth following drought. A second thing you'll note is that in many places, these reductions are quite large, especially in the southwestern United States. These are over 50% reductions in radial growth in the year following drought, despite the fact that we normalized for the climatic conditions. So these weren't abnormally dry years. Now, these reductions are really drastic. And I think they're especially surprising if you're someone who's familiar with vegetation models, because all of the most of the process-based models we have for understanding drought impacts can't simulate these post-drought lags in recovery. And even the few that can, they can't get anywhere near this magnitude. There's really no way we can simulate these 50% decreases in post-drought tree growth. So to me, when I see such a big discrepancy in our knowledge from observational data versus our knowledge from ecosystem or smaller scale plant models, this brings maybe a few alarm bells in my head. Maybe we're missing something really big in our models of the carbon cycle. If we're seeing these over 50% reductions in radial growth, what does this mean for how carbon is moving in and out of these ecosystems? So to get at this question, we paired these tree ring chronologies with this upscaled data set of whole ecosystem carbon uptake, or gross primary productivity, if you're familiar with the word. And you can just think of that just as how much carbon has flowed into these forest ecosystems and remains stored there on an annual basis. So it's just ecosystem photosynthesis, you can think of it as. And this is what we found when we did that. There's almost no color on this map here. There were very, very few sites where we found any significant post-drought reduction in ecosystem carbon uptake, and certainly no particular trend towards increases or decreases. So it really seems like what we can understand about drought impacts in radial tree growth versus what we understand in terms of carbon uptake are very, very decoupled. These processes are decoupled across the landscape. So when I first started talking with this about this result with some of my colleagues who are more focused on the modeling or remote sensing side of things, they brought up a really great critique of this, and that's that a lot of times some of these upscaled remote sensing derived semi-machine learning modeled approaches really underestimate the effects of drought. And that's a completely valid criticism, right? We don't want this result to be influenced by the methodology that we're using. And so what we wanted to do to circumvent this criticism is really go for the gold standard, which was direct measurements of ecosystem carbon uptake. And so we were able to get these direct comparisons of tree radial growth from tree ring chronologies and ecosystem carbon uptake from eddy covariance towers across North America and Europe. And what these towers are is just a way to directly measure whole ecosystem carbon uptake, gross primary productivity. And once we did that, we could go back, find severe droughts in the record here, and do this exact same calculation where we look at these post-drought changes in carbon uptake or radial growth. And sure enough, we found around a 25% reduction in radial growth following drought across all of these sites. And to no surprise, really, we were able to replicate exactly what we found using this larger approach that I showed you in the previous slides, where we saw no post-drought suppression of carbon uptake. So to return to our question here, what are the implications of these drought legacy effects for the carbon cycle? Well, it seems like this is on its face pretty good news, right? We didn't see 25% reductions in tree growth translate into 25% reductions in carbon uptake. The ecosystem is still photosynthesizing the same amount. But hold on 1 minute. This carbon is being fixed via photosynthesis. It's not going to radial growth. One of the reasons that forests store so much carbon and for so long is this radial growth. It's that above ground woody biomass. And if this carbon isn't being allocated towards this above ground woody biomass, it's almost necessarily going towards a tissue or a pool that has a much shorter turnover time, which means it's lost out to the atmosphere much faster. And so the answer to this question is really contingent on where that carbon that is being fixed is actually going within the forest. So we wanted to explore this scenario using a box model. And what we were able to do is calculate whole forest carbon turnover time due chiefly to these shifts in carbon allocation away from radial growth. This is just how fast or how many years it takes for all of the carbon in this forest ecosystem to cycle back out to the atmosphere. That's what whole forest carbon turnover time represents. So we got estimates of whole forest biomass carbon for all of our sites. We use species composition estimates to partition it out into all of the different species in the forest, and then species-specific allometric equations to partition that carbon in individual species to leaves, to the stem, which is bole, and to coarse roots and fine roots. And we used estimates of the lifespans of these individual tissues combined with our direct observations of these drought impacts on tree ring width in order to calculate a range of scenarios of what we might expect whole forest carbon turnover time to be if this carbon that wasn't allocated towards tree rings was instead allocated entirely towards foliage, towards coarse roots, and towards fine roots. And this is what we ended up finding. These are our different scenarios here on the x-axis, these allocation scenarios. And what you can see is depending on the allocation scenario, we found around a 1 to 4% decrease in whole forest carbon turnover time, which you might be thinking isn't that big of a change, right? It's just a couple of percentage points. But I would remind you that forests store a ton of carbon and they store it for a really long time. So any small perturbation of those dynamics is actually pretty impactful on the whole. So for some context here, these post-drought changes in turnover time due just to these shifts in carbon allocation are actually around 1/5 of the current trend in forest carbon turnover time due to climate change induced tree mortality. So put in that context, I think it's actually quite significant. Also note that this is definitely a conservative estimate. We only had the data necessary to run this model with allocation to various structural tissues. Based on what we know about tree physiology, a lot of that carbon is likely lost as respiration or put towards non-structural pools, which have extremely rapid turnover times. And so my bet is that this actual value is much larger. Okay, so what I was able to do is use this modeling approach to just constrain a number of scenarios of what could be happening here. But that doesn't speak to the realism, right? How much evidence is there that following drought, carbon is allocated somewhere other than the stem of the tree? Well, there is a ton of emerging evidence that these post-drought shifts in carbon allocation are quite large and quite pervasive. And to highlight that, I want to kind of show you a case study from one of the forests that was in our data set that really got hammered by a severe drought in 2012. And at this, during and following this drought, we saw exactly what we would expect to see given the slides that I showed you before. We found that tree radial growth is extremely sensitive to drought, around a 40% reduction during the drought event itself. And there was this drought legacy effect around 10%, or this 10% reduction in stand radial growth following drought. And as third time now I've presented something similar to this, there was really rapid recovery of ecosystem carbon uptake. So these are just smooth time series of gross primary productivity at this forest. And you can see the red line was the drought year. It's around a 40% reduction in carbon uptake. But when that drought ceased in late 2012, forest carbon uptake recovered rapidly. And in the year following drought, this blue line, it pretty much tracked exactly what we would expect during a climatically normal year, which indeed it was. So at this site, the reason for this decoupling between ecosystem carbon uptake and radial growth was actually allocation to the canopy, which was that scenario that I showed a couple slides ago. imparts the largest changes to whole forest carbon turnover time. So in addition to reductions in radial growth following drought, one of the most impactful consequences of this drought was around 40% reduction in leaf area index in this forest in the early growing season. You can just think of this as a metric of how many leaves are in the forest. Now, this might be a little bit surprising given the previous slide I showed you, which showed that the ecosystem was taking in exactly the amount of carbon we would expect. So I'm sitting here telling you that they're doing that with 40% fewer leaves. Well, that was exactly the case. We had direct measurements of leaf level photosynthetic rates in all of the constituent species in this forest. And we found, well, to compensate for a 40% reduction in the amount of leaves in the forest, all of the species upregulated their photosynthetic rate by around 40%. So they were photosynthesizing more, and they allocated it to rebuild the canopy that was suppressed in the early growing season, and it actually exceeded historical means for leaf area index by the middle of that growing season. So I want to take a step back at the end of this first section and recap what we now know about how forests recover from drought. Oh, well. First off is that lagged drought recovery in growth is extremely large and extremely pervasive. This existed across pretty much every site we looked for this phenomenon. And in many cases, especially in the American Southwest, it exceeded 50%. These are massive reductions in growth. But despite this, ecosystem carbon uptake really recovers quite rapidly. And the reason for this decoupling is potentially allocation to other tissues. And depending on which tissues that carbon gets allocated to, there could be really important implications of this phenomenon for the whole forest carbon cycle. So for the second part of this talk, I want to explore the other possibility, and that's that trees can't recover from drought and instead they die. The Western United States is a really fantastic place to be a person who investigates drought impacts on tree health, especially tree mortality. Drought is a much more frequent and impactful stressor on forest ecosystems out here than it is in the Midwestern or the Eastern United States. But also, it was recently shown that the era that we're living in out here is actually pretty climatically anomalous. These researchers here used tree ring chronologies to reconstruct soil moisture in the Western United States and found that we're living in what they termed a mega drought. And I love the term the mega drought, and what they're referring to is that this period, 2000 to 2018, was the second driest multi-decadal period of the last 1,200 years. And I've heard from some of these authors of this paper here that if this were to be updated through 2021, it would be incredibly likely that we are now in the driest period of the last 1,200 years. This mega drought is underlain by two somewhat unfortunate trends. First off is the really widespread and rapid increases in temperature and vapor pressure deficit of the atmosphere, which drives evaporation from the soil surface, stresses plants out at the leaf level, and impacts the mega drought that way. The second is widespread decreases in winter precipitation, and coupled with these increases in temperature has resulted in incredibly large and widespread reductions in snowpack in the early spring. This is trends in April snowpack over the last 60 years or so here. And there's a lot of red. The points are quite large. And this is kind of a scary map for people who live out here in the Western United States, right? A lot of the vegetation in our natural ecosystems depends quite heavily on water from this snowpack to recharge deep soil moisture stores, which can help a lot of plants survive a quite harsh, hot, dry growing season across the Western United States. You know, if you're also a person who cares about water management and water resources out here in the West, this should also be quite scary. And for those of you who are skiers who like to ski on the greatest snow on earth, as Utahns like to call it, this should also be quite scary as well. Okay, more bad news. As if this mega drought wasn't bad enough, in recent years, we've had a couple of severe acute drought events spring up. The first one really peaked in intensity in late summer 2018, centered in the Four Corners region. And the second one is still ongoing, but at least here in Utah was most severe midsummer 2021. Following both of these drought events, I received a number of reports from citizens, various stakeholders, people in the Forest Service, of these pockets of tree mortality that were developing in pinyon juniper woodlands that cover a lot of the southern part of Utah, but also southwest Colorado, New Mexico, Arizona, and a ton of Nevada. But drought-induced tree mortality really, it's nothing that new. But what really stood out to me about this was the species that was dying back in the vast majority of these reports, which was Utah juniper. So not only we had these widespread tree mortality events, but Utah juniper is generally known as one of the most drought-tolerant tree species we have out here in the Western United States. So it was incredibly puzzling to hear all of these reports of its dieback. And you can see an example of a stand that was hit really hard in southern Utah. Those are all junipers that have died back there. There are a couple of really simple reasons why juniper is so drought tolerant. First off is that it has incredibly deep roots. Its roots can go way down and access groundwater in some cases, but deep soil moisture, rock water, these water sources that are recharged by winter precipitation and can help these trees survive a very harsh growing season. Second is that juniper have xylem that are extremely resistant to hydraulic damage. One of the most direct consequences of drought stress on tree health is the formation of these little tiny air bubbles in the xylem, which is the tissue, the woody tissue in trees that conducts water from the roots all the way out to the leaves. And what these little air bubbles or embolisms do is they semi-permanently or permanently block water flow. And if you're a tree that can't move water from your roots out to your leaves, you can't photosynthesize, and you're in a little bit of trouble. But for various anatomical reasons that I won't get into, but happy to talk about later, juniper xylem are incredibly resistant to these little air bubbles forming. So given that, there was obviously this very puzzling species dynamic occurring, this incredibly drought-tolerant species dying, but that wasn't the only surprising thing. The other surprising aspect was the rapid speed at which these tree mortality events were really unfolding. We got reports of actually this mortality event in this picture, just 5 months after the onset of this drought in 2018. And that's probably a pretty reasonable time frame to kill a more mesic tree species. But a lot of researchers have done experiments where they've completely cut off water supply to Utah juniper before entirely. And it's taken 2, 3, 4 years to die back in most cases. So something really odd is going on here. Seemed like a number of agencies here also agreed that something was going on. So thank you to these 3 different programs for giving us funding to kind of bring together a group of collaborators from the university, the Forest Service, BLM, and actually some industry partners right now to really tackle a few basic questions. First off, how widespread is this mortality? And second, why is this tree species that we wouldn't expect to die following drought all of a sudden dying? So as a first step, we wanted to quantify how widespread this was. Was a lot of these reports we were getting were from retired foresters who are trained to notice this type of stuff. And is this just a couple pockets of tree mortality, or is this something more widespread? This question is a little bit harder than it might seem, because detecting widespread dieback in pinyon juniper woodlands is really a current challenge. The 2 main ways that we detect widespread tree mortality are these things called aerial detection surveys, where the Forest Service chooses a tract of land to fly over and detect mortality that way. Unfortunately, they don't fly pinyon juniper woodlands very often because they prioritize more economically valuable forest, unfortunately. And the second is with various remote sensing methods, which work really well in dense forests, where the canopy of the forest makes up a lot of the spectral signature, but pinyon juniper woodlands are really sparse. That signal from tree mortality gets pretty attenuated by the soil and from understory dynamics. So we had to go develop our own method for quantifying this dieback. We had a bunch of, we paired LiDAR data in order to delineate individual tree crowns in a number of plots across southern Utah. with drone imagery, which allowed us to quantify their change in color. So with both of those, we could get individual tree level maps of canopy dieback. And using those plot data, we could feed in Landsat vegetation indices, topographic variables, climate data, and use a machine learning approach to scale this up outside of our plots where we got these data directly, all the way to the pinyon juniper woodlands of San Juan County in the southeastern part of the state there, which is this intersection between the county in yellow and the PJ in green. This approach allowed us to make some really neat maps such as these. There are a couple of key takeaways from these maps. First off is that a lot of the county actually had some detectable level of dieback following this drought. But most of this was incredibly low level, below 5–10% relative canopy mortality. And that's not something you'd probably generally notice if you were just driving by. Instead, a lot of the really severe dieback was spatially localized in a lot of these hotspots in the landscape, which you can see in panels C, D, and E there, which were some of the worst spots that we found that had over 30, 40, 50, even 60% in some cases canopy mortality. We're able to use a variable importance analysis in this to discern something pretty simple and intuitive, is that there was more dieback. These hotspots tended to be located in drier areas, so lower elevation areas, higher temperatures, drier soils. I'll also note that we made these maps just following the 2018 drought, and following the 2021 drought. In just the last couple of months, I've received actually over 40 new reports of juniper mortality across the whole Southwest. And so we actually have a proposal in to try and expand this out to all of pinyon juniper's range and develop this tool that land managers could use to actually map pinyon juniper mortality in near real time. So that's hopefully going to get funded, and that will be quite exciting. Okay, so it seems like the first question here has a pretty conclusive answer. This dieback was fairly extensive, yet spatially quite patchy. Great, we know where this dieback is occurring, but we still don't know why. So to tackle this, I set up a number of field plots in southeastern Utah. You might recognize some of the landmarks and the towns there that radiated out from a lot of these really severe hotspots that had in excess of 50–60% dieback in many cases. And we did a ton of sampling and found some really clear trends. So first off, completely replicated what we found with our remote sensing analysis, which is that there was more dieback in these lower elevation areas and hotter, drier areas. I can put pretty much any temperature or aridity indicator on that x-axis and get the exact same story. The second trend that popped out was that there was more hydraulic damage in these trees that were experiencing more severe dieback, these little air bubbles that block water flow. And it's the direct causal driver of dieback in this case. So we saw a very strong positive association between hydraulic damage and juniper dieback. Next, we wanted to investigate the possibility that there could be some biotic agent to this dieback. So we went out with a number of entomologists and pathologists, collaborators from the Forest Service, did a ton of sampling to try and look for insects or diseases that could be causing this, and pretty much completely struck out. We didn't see anything that could have caused this mortality. So all of these lines of evidence point to something really simple here. It is the direct effect of drought that is killing these trees. It was direct moisture stress or aridity stress on the tree's hydraulic system. But this obviously leaves this question only half answered, because this tree is supposed to be very drought tolerant. So why is it dying back right now? And why is it dying back at all? So a lot of credit for this actually goes to Derek Kober, who's been an undergrad, who's been working with me for the last 3 years. He started as a freshman. It's been really, really impressive. And so when we wanted to kind of think about some hypotheses for why these junipers were dying back, we put our heads together and we remembered that one of the traits that makes juniper so drought tolerant is its deep rooting system. But as I presented at the beginning of this section, we've been seeing these really widespread reductions in snowpack, which is the moisture source that is supposed to recharge these really deep soil moisture stores that the deep roots can access in the first place. So maybe they just ran out of this really key moisture source that was the key to their drought tolerance in the past. So we use some isotopic techniques to really be able to reconstruct the average depth at which these trees are taking up their moisture from the soil. Not going to go into details as to the method or the unit, other than to say that we found that trees that were dying back more tended to rely on much deeper soil moisture stores. So in this case, it really seems like our hypothesis here was supported. These trees that had a deeper rooting system, they took up more of their moisture from these deep soil layers. They were probably running out of this key source of moisture. Now, if we saw this long-term trend, this long-term decline in deep soil moisture levels, that probably just didn't affect the trees. It probably just didn't kill them in a one-off event, right? There was probably some sort of evidence of their long-term decline. They probably just didn't decide to up and die one day without giving us any clue as to the fact that they were struggling up until then. So what we did is we are in the process of developing tree ring chronologies on all of these sampled trees here. These data are just flowing in right now, so I can't say anything too conclusive, but I can show you a time series here of tree ring width that is really, that's showing us some really common things across a lot of these trees that were dying back in a big way. And that's emerging evidence of early warning signs that have preceded the dieback of these trees. Specifically, over this mega drought period, we're seeing decreases in growth and increases in year-to-year variance in ring width, which are both pretty well-established signals that show that the tree is kind of struggling to hang on. Okay, so for this second question here, I think we also can draw a pretty conclusive answer. We've had around 20 years now of chronic heat drought stress due to these mega drought conditions, which has led to the depletion of key soil moisture stores, these really deep stores of moisture that are recharged by winter precipitation, which has led to a long-term decline in the health of these trees. Layered on top of that was a very severe acute drought stress event in 2018, which caused direct damage to the tree's ability to move water from roots out to leaves. And it was this combination of chronic plus acute stress that has probably led to this dieback of these trees that in many cases have survived droughts for 200, 300, even one tree, 400 years. So I want to return to this overarching question again. What happens after drought? Well, in this case, they couldn't quite hang on. They're in the process of dying or they have already died. Junipers may have been pushed to some sort of tipping point or some sort of threshold by this combination of chronic plus acute drought stress. At least for me, this has really caused me to reconsider, I think, what I thought I knew about the ecology of these woodland ecosystems and how drought will affect these ecosystems into the future. Because in some ways, this ecosystem is a model for understanding drought ecophysiology. And if there's this traditional paradigm that juniper is incredibly drought tolerant, all of a sudden it starts dying due to this chronic plus acute drought stress. We need to rethink how these woodlands and probably forests in the West as a whole are going to operate moving forward into the future. So I think there is a much broader question lingering here, which I've alluded to a couple times. What is the fate of these pinyon juniper woodlands? Because after all, we're still in this mega drought period. And even if we escape this mega drought tomorrow, we're still projected pretty much no matter what to have increases in temperature, increases in aridity, decreases in soil moisture in the future. So what's going to happen to this incredibly iconic landscape? It's actually Bears Ears in the background right there. So this question, what is the fate of pinyon juniper woodlands, is a really big near to medium term goal of my research program. Is this a kind of one-off self-thinning event after which the ecosystem is going to be able to recover and operate just fine? Or is it really, this threshold or this tipping point that signals the loss of some of this lower elevation juniper woodland? So I have plans to tackle this in the next few years across a really wide range of spatial and temporal scales. So first off is I've installed a lot of great instrumentation down at these sites that really does a fantastic job of monitoring the health of the forest and monitoring the flow of carbon and water in and out of this ecosystem. So we have an eddy covariance tower, which is one of those kind of suites of instrumentation that I showed previously that quantifies how much carbon and water is moving in and out of the ecosystem. It's kind of like watching the ecosystem breathe in a way. We have a really advanced soil moisture monitoring system out at these plots. And probably the coolest thing is we have a number of really neat sensors that can continuously monitor the health of these trees' hydraulic system as they potentially continue to die back. So not only does this provide me with a lot of really amazing observational, kind of medium-term observational data in an unfortunately pretty undersampled ecosystem, but having all of these really great data in hand is going to allow me to parameterize a really cutting-edge plant hydraulics and soil hydrology model that takes one of these optimization-based approaches and can simulate a lot of these physiological indicators that we care about when assessing the health of a forest. So things like hydraulic damage, photosynthesis, transpiration. And I can run this model using a wide range of historical or future climate scenarios to really hopefully try and understand the future of pinyon juniper woodlands across a wide range of different climate change scenarios and quantify the risk that a lot of these different woodland areas are going to have in the coming decades across the landscape. So pinyon juniper woodlands here are definitely, like I mentioned, it's the focus of my near-term research program. That's kind of where the momentum and the funding is right now. But these types of questions and approaches, aren't just applicable to one ecosystem type. The Western United States as a whole is increasingly exposed to novel climate regimes, novel disturbances, just novel environmental stressors as a whole. And understanding their fate in a changing world is going to be a really big component of my long-term research program. Unfortunately, this question is difficult. A lot of our current modeling approaches to understand forest health into the future are in some ways fall short. We still have a fairly poor understanding of how to properly implement and parameterize moisture stress in a lot of these models, and we have an even worse understanding of how to properly model drought-induced tree mortality. And in my work, I think what I've shown a number of times is one of the reasons these modeling approaches fall short is they underestimate just how smart trees are in some cases. What do I mean by how smart trees are? Well, a lot of these models are parameterized with single values of really key drought tolerance traits that are taken as a mean from a trait database measured on saplings in the greenhouse or something like that. And this is probably in many cases a necessary modeling simplification that unfortunately kind of ignores decades of research that shows that these drought tolerance traits vary really wildly across space and across the landscape. A couple examples of this. Think about rooting depth. This is one of those drought tolerance traits that was so important for juniper. Rooting depth obviously varies a lot throughout the lifespan of an individual plant, but it also varies really quite highly across the landscape due to just variability in subsurface features. Are you hitting bedrock or not? The other key trait that made juniper so drought tolerant was resistance to hydraulic damage. This is also very variable across space and across time. This is a kernel density plot from a recent review that we put out looking at P50, which is probably the most common trait used to quantify resistance to hydraulic damage. We grabbed values of P50 from the literature for a number of different common Western tree species. You can see Utah juniper there in the red. And the take home here is that it really varies tremendously. Finally, kind of more stand scale factors like density and leaf area are really important controls on water supply and water demand at the stand level, and are also incredibly important for properly predicting tree drought responses. So I want to show you an example of how much this matters. Here I'm using this optimization-based tree hydraulics model to predict hydraulic damage during a simulated drought, actually the drought of 2018 here, where we had weather data for that period. If I use mean values of these 4 traits from a trait database, this is what I get. I get around between 50 and 60% hydraulic damage. But if I vary all of these traits within their observed distribution, so things that people have measured before, the amount of hydraulic damage that I get as an output is incredibly variable, and in many cases actually exceeds likely mortality thresholds. So getting these parameters right can, in some cases, mean the difference between predicting life versus predicting death in forest stands. So it's really no wonder to me why historically predicting drought-induced tree mortality has been so difficult or elusive. So this is definitely an objective of my long-term research program, just to understand the degree to which trait acclimation can actually buffer against climate change impacts. And I see the three main pillars of this research. First off, quantify natural trait variability across climatic gradients in space to understand how some of this trait variability relates to forest health and just how much can this vary across the landscape. Second, use a number of approaches to understand the natural in situ limits to how much these traits can vary over an individual tree's life. And then take both of these strands of knowledge here into our modeling approaches and see if we can do a better job of predicting tree drought responses by including the acclimation of some of these key drought tolerance traits, and also understand the degree to which some of these acclimation processes can help potentially save forests from severe dieback in the future. I think one of the reasons I'm excited about this future research direction is I see a lot of relevance for fundamental questions in global ecology, but also management and societal implications pertaining to understanding the vulnerability of Western ecosystems to change. I'll say that another reason I'm really excited to be talking to all of you about this today is because it seems like Utah State is a really fantastic place to be conducting this work into the future. There's a really awesome group of plant, animal, fire restoration, pretty much any type of ecologist out there, along with hydrologists and climatologists. And I think this work is going to be really, really interdisciplinary, and it's great to see so many collaborations with people in the department, college, and university. Second is the students here seem really passionate about environmental issues, and this research is going to be really amenable to mentoring undergrads, master's students, PhD students across the Logan campus and potentially elsewhere all across the state. And finally, in a number of ways, Utah is really kind of at the epicenter of climate change impacts. And so it's a really fantastic place to be investigating these uncertainties regarding forest drought responses. And I think that requires a strong collaborative network that I've been really, really careful to build across the state over the years between Utah State, University of Utah, and especially the US Forest Service. So I want to return to the question that I posed in the beginning of this talk. How will forests fare in a warming and drying world? And I don't, unfortunately, have a concise answer to this because in many cases it differs depending on what you're measuring. If we're talking about forest drought recovery, it really differs across processes and scales. And this perhaps isn't the most satisfying answer, but it gives us a really important clue as to how these questions need to be approached and answered in the future, which is holistically across processes and across scales. Second, out here in the American West, our forests might not, in some cases, fare so well in a warming and drying world. And in some cases, we might need to reconsider our existing paradigms of how drought impacts Western ecosystems. And finally, the future is uncertain, but there is potentially hope. In many cases, I think the future health of these Western forests is really going to hinge on the limits of acclimation to novel climatic conditions. I think if there's one broader take-home message I want to leave with you here, it's that solving these really big big questions in global ecology increasingly requires working across all of these processes and across all of these methodologies. And that's why, I think with where I've positioned my research program at the intersection of all of these approaches, it's going to be in a really great position to tackle some of these pressing environmental needs into the future. And so that with, I'm happy to take any questions.
Questions?
Nice talk and nice story. Thank you. By definition, pinyons co-located in the juniper do you have any, even if it's anecdotal observations, what's happening to the pinyon in the areas you're seeing these massive drought dry-offs? I know they both have different evolutionary strategies for dealing with that water depth, but any observations on that?
Yeah, that's a really fantastic question. That is something we've been trying to tackle at the exact same time. It didn't quite fit into the talk here, and we, as of now, have less data to answer that question. But in these plots where we've seen really severe juniper dieback, that is at probably the extreme dry limit of pinyon distribution. And so if you look at the pure plot basis, pixel basis numbers of tree mortality in pinyon or juniper, you actually see a similar trend. So you're seeing a plot with 50% juniper dieback. You also see 50% pinyon dieback. But the problem is that that plot had 80 juniper trees in it and 2 pinions. And so it's a little bit difficult to understand, is this actual greater drought tolerance in these pinions, or is it just the fact that they don't exist there? And of course, there could be historical legacies of this in a lot of cases. Some of the droughts that we've had in the early 2000s may have come through and killed off a lot of the more drought susceptible pinions in this kind of lower end of their distributional limit, which leaves a couple pinions on the landscape that might be, for various reasons, really well suited to tolerate drought. We're hoping that some of the follow-up isotopic work and tree rearing work will really be able to let us get at this question of, are these pinions that have survived in these plots, are they actually much more drought tolerant or not? So yeah.
I have just I'm curious about the methodology behind the juniper dieback mortality. How do you determine that it was hydraulic damage rather than other things? Was it just lack of evidence of beetles or any other kind of biotic agent? Or
Yeah, so I mean, the lack of evidence of a biotic agent was a huge part of it, but we can directly measure hydraulic damage in these trees. It's a complicated looking, but actually really easy method. You actually just drip water through the tree stem, and using a kind of a somewhat complicated system to measure the flow rate of water through the tree stem. But you can quantify how much water, like the speed at which water moves through the tree stem, and then you can actually put these samples underwater, expose them to a vacuum, which sucks all the air bubbles out of the xylem, and then see what the rate of increase was in flow throughout that sample. And so you can kind of get a maximum hydraulic conductivity, they call it, and then a native hydraulic conductivity. And that way you can back out what percentage of those xylem vessels were blocked up with air bubbles.
Okay, well, I have a question. So you mentioned that rooting depth was important for the juniper. So is that, were those differences in rooting depth among individuals within a stand, or was that differences in rooting depth at the stand level or some other scale?
Yeah, it was differences in individual rooting depth. So the method that we used to quantify that was, they were samples taken of the water sitting inside the stem of an individual tree. And so what we actually did is all of the trees that we measured hydraulic damage on and quantified canopy level dieback, we also quantified individual level rooting depth. And so I didn't show it in this talk, but we see a pretty strong relationship with rooting depth and hydraulic damage too, which is why they died back.
And was that related to age then at all?
We can't really say too much about age at this point. I think partially, well, so far, some of the tree data that we have regarding age, the data are still being processed. It's also uncertain. Sometimes we didn't quite get to the middle of the tree. With these methods, with our kind of first pass estimates of tree age, we didn't really see that much of a relationship or any relationship between tree age and dieback.
Very interesting. I think land managers all over the West are giving each other high fives because they've been trying to get rid of junipers for a long time. The land managers have been complaining about juniper encroachment since the 70s sometime. how is this not just a resetting of the clock back to the time before the junipers started to encroach? Can you argue that?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really complex issue that lies at, the intersection of a lot of different stakeholders, land management, these types of things. And yeah, when you're talking about junipers in particular, there's a lot of strong opinions out there, I think. There are issues with encroachment in many places of various juniper species. I will say in the area where all of this is being done, encroachment is not a modern issue. It may, species distributions are always shifting, but these aren't the regions where people are generally concerned about juniper encroachment. If anything, in this region, there are issues with recruitment of both pinyon and juniper. It's just extremely difficult in this harsh environment to get seedlings to grow. So what I would say to that is that there are a lot of legitimate concerns for various reasons about juniper encroachment in different places, but in a lot of these ecosystems that I'm talking about, I mean, these are extremely iconic woodlands in my view that make up a lot of the places that people think about when they think of iconic landscapes in the US. I mean, it's like southern Utah, right? And so I would say that, this is not a positive thing. I think of these woodlands as quite beautiful. And also surprisingly, we're doing some work right now that's indicating that they're really a surprisingly large, there's a surprisingly large amount of woody biomass in these ecosystems. So they actually represent, I think, more carbon storage than we previously thought. And obviously, if trees leave that landscape, that carbon storage capacity is pretty heavily diminished.
Thanks, Steve. I have a question about where the carbon is going. You showed that even though the tree growth is dropping a lot after droughts, but the whole system carbon uptake is still quite high. You suggested it's going to other places in the trees. In these trees, is this close enough to a monoculture that you can ignore all the other plant species that are out there? Could herbaceous plants be compensating for, yeah.
Yeah, no, that's a really great question. So, when you think about this decoupling between ecosystem carbon uptake and radial growth, there's, a class of mechanisms that could cause that are, biological in nature. It could be these active or passive changes in carbon allocation. And like you said, it also could be methodological, right? For a lot of these tree ring studies, we're sampling trees that are selected for high climate sensitivity. We're not sampling understory trees, and we're certainly not sampling understory vegetation. I will say that we have done follow-up work looking at the climate sensitivity of understory species at that site, and also doing in one of the studies I referenced, we actually did a more ecological sampling that gets a pretty good sampling of all of the different representative types of trees in the forest. With regards to understory, that's a little bit more, it's a little bit more uncertain. And based on, I think, what we know about how the understory behaved at some of these specific forests, it seems really unlikely to be the case. But actually, in terms of near-term future work, that's something that I'm actively thinking about. At a number of sites there, I'm looking to collect these tree ring chronologies where they have these eddy covariance towers, and in some of these cases, they are directly quantifying net primary productivity of herbaceous or understory vegetation. And actually, at some of these sites, they have technology on this is still pretty, I think, kind of in its infancy, or the method is, but an understory eddy covariance station. And so hopefully that way you'd be able to disentangle the role of the understory from the overstory. And so that's, I think, hopefully something that I'll try and tackle next summer.
I'm curious, going back to the first part of your talk, were you looking only at the 1 year following drought at how the carbon was stored? And if so, how do you think that changes like 5 years, 10 years after a drought?
Yeah, that's a great question. Nice job picking up on that. I think I tried to simplify here just to show 1 year after drought, but we have looked throughout time. And I think a general trend that we've seen is that in a lot of more mesic forests, in general, these lags in drought recovery tend to only happen for 1 year following drought. But a lot of the studies in more arid regions like the southwestern United States, I think in a lot of cases have found lags in drought recovery 2, 3, 4 years following drought. And you can kind of imagine that reduction in growth diminishes over time. And there's I think one study that I'm aware of that has actually used some different statistical techniques and has found that there's kind of this memory of this drought event is actually still impacting tree growth, I think 8, 9, and 10 years following drought. And so, yeah, it's variable, and it seems like the more arid of an ecosystem the tree is in, the longer temporally it takes for that tree to recover, and also the larger the reduction in growth rate.
Okay, any last, yep.
So this is just a question about the last thing you said about the severity of about droughts in the West and longer recovery. So do you think that's because the impact of the drought is larger, or because the ability to recover is more strongly limited by the environment or by the species characteristics?
Could you repeat the second part of that?
The recovery takes longer in the West. The memory, whatever the effects are, lasts longer. Do you think that's because the impact of the drought is larger, it's drier, it's hotter, or do you think it's because the ability to recover is more limited either by the biology of the plants or by the environment?
Mm-hmm. You know, I can't say conclusively. I have a feeling that probably a lot of it is the latter. You know, if we look at the general climate sensitivity at some of these sites out here versus more mesic ecosystems, in many cases, you know, drought is generally more limiting to tree function, but the trees are adapted to a drier and hotter environment. So you can think of the drought as more severe in an absolute sense, but in a relative sense, sometimes it's not. And if we start looking at things on a relative sense, we see pretty similar sensitivities of tree growth to drought. But I think out here, it's just that because that environment is so harsh, there's a much smaller window and a lesser opportunity for these trees to, you know, photosynthesize at really high rates following drought, repair some of this drought-induced damage. So a big, one of the main hypotheses for the direct mechanism of these reductions in growth following drought is actually damage to the tree's hydraulic system. And that damage is, the ways you get around that are actually just grow new wood, right? And just cut your losses, forget about the xylem that have air bubbles in it. Or actually, there are a couple of physiological mechanisms that can be used to repair that hydraulic damage. Unfortunately, a lot of trees out in the West here have much lower year-to-year growth rates than trees out east. So I think more limited ability to put on new xylem to compensate for that. And also these mechanisms that can repair or get rid of these air bubbles in the xylem, they require pretty extremely wet conditions to actually operate, because you need to kind of reverse the negative tension that caused that to occur in the first place. And so it needs to be pretty saturated, and that doesn't happen out here very often.
Okay, well, thank you. Let's give them a last round of applause.
Thanks, everyone.